for which our speaker will provide the definitive answers, of course. We're absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Indyk. Let me briefly say a couple of words about his chronology. He's an Australian, as you know, product of the Bachelor of Science, Economics, University of Sydney. His doctorate is from the Australian National University. He's taught at a number of universities, Macquarie in Australia. He's been at the Dayan Center in Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University, and also at the Middle East Center at Columbia, and of course Johns Hopkins School of International Studies in Washington. He headed up an institute which he founded, Washington Center for the Study of Near East Policy, for about 8 years before he was very, very active in government during the Clinton years. He served as a special assistant to President Clinton. He was head of the Near Eastern and South Asian area within the National Security Council, became our ambassador to Israel, and was that for 3 years in the mid-90s. Mr. Rabin was the primary prime minister during that time. He served actually during a period of 5 different Israeli prime ministers, which he suggested was a piece of cake. And those weren't his words. He would never say piece of cake. But a very, very interesting experience. He was our Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs for 3 years also, then became our ambassador once more. During the time at which a comprehensive peace seemed as if it might be possible, and during the time when it was very important to deal with the Intifada. In 2001, he joined the Brookings Institution, where he is now. He's been a member of that foreign policy study team, an important part of it, and heads up the Sabin Institute within the institution. It's my great pleasure to present to you the very distinguished and widely published and impressive scholar on the Middle East, Dr. Martin Indyk.
Thank you very much. Did you notice how he managed to do that without a note? That's the most impressive thing I've seen in terms of presentation of my biography, since it has all sorts of impossible things to pronounce, like Macquarie. So thank you for that. I'm honoured by the attention you paid. I'm also honoured by the fact that so many of you came out to hear me talk about such a dismal topic. And I have to forewarn you that I don't have much good news to bring to you this evening, and that's never a good way to start or finish a speech, but unfortunately the circumstances in the Middle East these days are such that it is the reality, and I apologize in advance for the gloom and doom that I'm about to spread here. As I was being introduced, I was thinking, well, I can't claim like John Bolton to be a Baltimorean. You know, my connection is a close one in the sense that I'm only 1 hour's drive away down in Washington. But I did grow up in Sydney on a harbour like this one, so I guess that's a connection. And perhaps my closest connection to Baltimore was one that I was very pleased to make tonight, and that is that the person who worked very closely with me for most of my years in the government as my deputy in various positions is indeed a Baltimorean. His name is David Satterfield, and his mother is in the audience tonight. And I want to acknowledge her wherever she is, because there she is. Because many of you may not know this, but I'm sure she will never forget it every day, is that David is doing God's work in Baghdad as the #2 in the American embassy there to our ambassador Al-Khalilzad, and cannot imagine a more difficult job than the one that he's doing, and you should all be very proud of him, as I am. What to do with Hamas is the question that I have chosen to address this evening. It obviously refers to the fact that in the elections that took place in the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza a few months ago, as you know, Hamas surprised everybody, including itself, and won a majority of the seats and now controls the Palestinian Legislative Council and has formed the government of the Palestinian Authority. The expectation beforehand was that Hamas would do well. It did not expect to actually take control of the government. Its decision to run in elections, which it had previously boycotted, was a decision to move into the political process and to reap the rewards of its 5 years of fighting Israel during the Intifada, or the Palestinian uprising, when it employed, as you surely know, the most horrendous terrorist tactics of suicide bombings, including using women to go and kill innocent men, women and children in the streets of Israel. And that effort had gained it considerable popularity amongst the Palestinians. And as a result of that, Hamas decided to try, as I said, to reap the political rewards of that through joining the electoral process. It was a very astute decision on their part, a very carefully calculated one, which included an understanding that the Palestinian people, after 5 years of this violence and terrorism, were exhausted and needed a break from it. And therefore Hamas entered into this, what's called a hudna, or a period of calm, in which they stopped their terrorist attacks, and Israel stopped its targeted killing of Hamas's leaders, and an equilibrium of sorts was established, in which Hamas was then free to focus on the effort to gain power. And during that time, I think it was about 15 months in which Hamas was not involved in terrorist activities, the Israelis, going through their own political process and conclusions about the hopelessness of making peace with the Palestinians after they had made Yasser Arafat an offer through President Clinton at the end of the Clinton administration for some 95 to 97% of the West Bank, all of Gaza, all of sovereignty, Palestinian sovereignty in all of Arab East Jerusalem, plus sovereignty over the surface of the Temple Mount and half of the old city of Jerusalem, and a fair resolution of the refugee problem. After making that offer through President Clinton, and after Arafat had rejected it and resorted to violence, the Israelis had come to the conclusion after 4 or 5 years of this that they needed to find another way, that negotiating with the Palestinians clearly didn't work, and it was better simply to turn their backs on the Palestinians, to separate from them, to pull out of Gaza first, and we'll come back to this, but also from the West Bank, to put up a fence and a wall in Jerusalem, and essentially find a different unilateral answer to the question of what to do about the Palestinians, to simply leave them to their own fate. And that decision on the part of the Israeli people first, and Sharon, the Prime Minister at the time, was reacting to that pressure, first by building the fence and then by deciding to evacuate all of the settlements from Gaza and leave Gaza. As a consequence of that, Hamas became the unintended beneficiary because Hamas could claim that its use of violence and terror was responsible for Israel's departure from Gaza, and that this was a far more effective way to get Israel to withdraw from Palestinian territory than the path of negotiations, which, from the Palestinian point of view, may have led to partial withdrawals from the West Bank and Gaza, but left them in a situation in which they were effectively caged in, could not move between different cities and population areas except through Israeli roadblocks, and felt that the whole peace process had actually worsened their condition. So Hamas was the unintended beneficiary of a process in which first the Israelis were disillusioned with the peace process and decided to leave Gaza unilaterally, which was seen as a great victory for violence and terror rather than negotiations. And the Palestinians became disillusioned with the negotiating process with the Israelis and turned increasingly to Hamas because their way seemed to work better. And so that is what I think gave Hamas a major boost. Added to that were two other factors. One was an extraordinary skillfulness on Hamas's part in terms of organising the elections, running clean and effective candidates, credible candidates, and disciplined approach to the election such that in the constituencies where the rival Fatah ruling party ran several candidates and split the Fatah vote, Hamas ran single candidates. As a consequence of this, and the second factor, which was that Fatah itself had become discredited in the eyes of many Palestinians because of, number one, its failure to deliver in any effective way on the Palestinian desire for an independent state, and number two, its corrupt, tyrannical rule that Yasser Arafat had imposed on the West Bank and Gazan citizens for some 10 years. The combination of all of these factors produced the Hamas victory. They actually only got 45% of the vote. They didn't win a majority of the vote. But because of this disciplined approach to the constituencies, they were able to win a majority of the seats and therefore take control of the government. Their natural constituency is probably around 30%. But the 15% additional votes comes from those other factors that I was just describing. So it's important to understand that the victory comes not just from a kind of rejection of a failed leadership of the Fatah ruling party, but comes from a number of other factors that are likely to be abiding over time. Hamas's own effectiveness and the desire of the Israelis to get out of territory, such that any additional moves which the newly elected government in Israel under Prime Minister Olmert is likely to undertake in the West Bank now, he has a mandate to do that, those additional moves will be seen as a victory for Hamas as well, because Hamas will inherit the territory, not through negotiations, but through unilateral moves on Israel's part. What the significance of the Hamas victory means in the context of the peace process that was launched back in 1973 by Anwar Sadat and Henry Kissinger and Golda Meir and Yitzhak Rabin, a process that was led and dominated by the United States, which produced an Israel-Egypt peace treaty, a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan, and a series of Palestinian agreements, and a number of disengagement agreements, including on the Syrian track. What these developments mean for that process that lasted for 3 decades and produced a considerable amount of peace along the way is, I'm afraid to say, that peace process is dead for the time being. It's over. In fact, it's been over for the last 5 years. We just didn't want to believe it. The peace process as we knew it from 1973 on ended in the year 2000. Ended when President Clinton put down those parameters for a 2-state solution, and Yasser Arafat rejected them. Since then, 5 years now, there have been no substantive peace negotiations. And now we have, on the one hand, a Hamas government which has as its objective not peace with Israel, but the replacement of Israel with a Palestinian state in all of historic Palestine, which would be under Waqf, or an Islamic trust, in God's name, as it were. And on the other side, as I already indicated, an Israeli people and an Israeli government that no longer believe that peace is possible, especially with a Hamas government, no longer believe that there is a reliable Palestinian partner, and have decided that they should go their own way, separate from the Palestinians, leave the West Bank as they left Gaza, and put up this wall and fence as a way of protecting themselves from what emerges on the other side under Hamas's rule. So that's the first bit of gloomy news. But the significance of Hamas's victory goes beyond the death of the peace process to a much broader impact on the overall war that we have been waging in this country against terrorism. And it's important to understand this. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict serves as the seam line between the West and the Muslim world. And it's therefore no coincidence that the Palestinian issue is such a divisive issue between the West and the East, the Arab world and the Islamic world. And now we have on this seam line a victory for an Islamic fundamentalist party that is a terrorist organization. It's on our State Department terrorist list. And it has now taken government in the most sensitive area of the Middle East and the Islamic world. And the significance of that is that this is, as Khaled Mashal, one of the leaders of Hamas, pointed out, a victory, not just for Hamas, but for Islamic fundamentalists, and, as he pointed out, in Tehran, this is a victory for Iran as well. And one could add a victory for al-Qaeda. Why? Because, you see, al-Qaeda did not consider the Palestinian issue as its issue. It's interesting to note that before 9/11, al-Qaeda did not view the Palestinian issue as a kind of clean issue. Why? Because Palestinian leadership was engaged in negotiations with Israel and the United States and making agreements with them. So this was not the pure jihad that al-Qaeda was teaching its recruits. The pure jihad was actually in Chechnya or Bosnia, certainly in Saudi Arabia against American troops there. But in Palestine, there it was a much less clear situation. And they basically did not attempt to get involved. After 9/11, with the Intifada in the Palestinian territories, al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, Ayman al-Zawahiri, saw the opportunity to kind of glom onto the anger that was being generated by the conflict, the terrorism and the Israeli retaliation. But now they have an opportunity to take advantage of Hamas's victory, to move into Gaza and to develop this arena as an arena of conflict. And we see al-Qaeda moving to Jordan, on the West Bank and Israel's borders, into Syria and Lebanon, and into Egypt, into the Sinai. And we've seen a series of quite spectacular terrorist attacks in those countries. But they're building up an infrastructure so that they can make this now an arena of conflict. And I expect that the Hamas-led government will facilitate that. Similarly, it's a victory for Iran, as Khalid Mashal said. Iran has been aggressively engaged in supporting Palestinian terror groups through the 5 years of the Intifada. They did it via Hezbollah, their proxies in Lebanon. They did it via Palestine Islamic Jihad, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Iranian intelligence services, trained, directed, funded by the Iranian intelligence services. And they've done it increasingly through the financing of Fatah's own Al-Aqsa brigades, who were also involved in violence and terrorist activities. And they did it from the beginning of the Intifada. Every time that Hamas decided to calm things down, you saw Palestine Islamic Jihad or Hezbollah-backed Palestinian irregulars, we can call them, taking terrorist actions, which then led to Israeli retaliations, which then heated up the whole cycle of violence again. And even during the period in which Hamas, over the last 15 months, decided they would not participate in terrorist attacks, you saw Palestine Islamic Jihad responsible for every single terrorist attack that took place over the last 15 months. And that can be directly connected to Iran. And so Iran now has an opportunity through Hezbollah and through its other connections to build a base of operations in Gaza and to, again, fuel this conflict, partly for strategic reasons, because this regime in Iran, as hard as it is for us to believe, actually believes in destroying Israel. Ahmadinejad, when he says that, actually believes it, that Israel should be wiped off the map and that they have a chance of doing it through this process. But also, Iran will step up its activities there for tactical reasons, because it's a way of reminding us, as one of their spokesmen said just recently, when your next speaker, John Bolton, threatened them with painful consequences. You may recall that the spokesman for the Iranian government stood up and said, if the United States thinks if the United States thinks that it can cause us pain and harm, we can cause the United States pain and harm. Let the ball roll, which is, I guess, a quaint Iranian way of saying bring it on. But bringing it on, one place they're going to bring it on is in this Palestinian arena now. And finally, in terms of its implication, Hamas's victory's implication for the broader war on terror, is the implications for the Bush administration's strategy for fighting terror. Because if you recall President Bush's State of the Union address, given after Hamas's victory this year, he made a very strong point of saying democracy is the answer to terror. And this administration, I'm sorry, I wasn't joking, he said that, and this administration has based its strategy of fighting terror not just on rooting them out in the Al-Qaeda out in Afghanistan and trying to find Osama bin Laden there, or trying to fight them in Iraq. But President believes strongly that democracy is the answer to terror, and that through giving people freedom and a choice of leadership in the Middle East, it will dry up the swamp, take away the sense of hopelessness and alienation and humiliation from the people, and that will reduce the ability of the Al-Qaeda and others to gain support from the people in the Middle East. It will do away with the sickness at the heart of the Arab order. But Hamas's victory cannot be seen as a victory for democracy over terror, because Hamas is a terrorist organization which used democracy to gain a victory over the forces of moderation. And that is a profound problem for our whole strategy of winning the war on terror, because wherever we have succeeded through pressing governments in the Middle East to open their political space, it's the Islamists that have walked into that space. If you'll allow me a little bit of a digression here on the whole issue of democracy, I really am going to get to what to do about Hamas, but since there isn't much to do about it, I would ask your indulgence to let me digress onto this subject for a moment. The problem with this is not the basic thesis as I've outlined it. The problem is the way in which the administration has gone about promoting democracy in the Middle East. Because democracy must not, should not, be equated with elections. Democracy is about many other things that go to the heart of the sense of grievance that Arab people feel. It's about respect, freedom, dignity, human dignity, rule of law, independent judiciary, freedom of the press. All of these things are essential components in the promotion of democracy. By the way, those were precisely the things that the Bush administration outlined in its first national security strategy paper back in 2002. Didn't mention elections in that strategy paper. But now, somehow, the whole effort to promote democracy is morphed into what I call the purple rule of thumb. You know, if Arabs are holding up their purple thumb to show that they voted, this is an achievement for democracy. Well, in some ways it's true. But in many other ways, it's not true. It's not a victory for democracy if the parties that are winning those elections are winning those elections and taking power with militias that are more powerful than the government's army. That's precisely what we managed to do in Iraq. And we're paying the price for it now, in a disaster. But we didn't just do it in Iraq, we did it in Lebanon, where there was a resolution, 1559 of the United Nations Security Council, which said the Syrian troops have to get out and Hezbollah has to disarm. And we said Syrian troops have to get out, but we'll leave Hezbollah's disarmament until after the elections. And what happened? Hezbollah moved into the government via the election process with its militia and its terrorist cadre, and it now has greater military capability than the Lebanese army itself, and is able to paralyse Lebanese politics and paralyse the Lebanese government because it went through the electoral process into government with its militias. And now we have the exact same thing in Palestine. The Oslo agreements, which govern the holding of elections in the Palestinian areas, said very explicitly that parties that have not disarmed cannot run in the elections. And the Israelis came to Washington and said, what about this? What are you going to do about this? And because elections are the thing in which we'll promote freedom and democracy and end the war on terror, the administration said, let's not worry about that. It's important that Hamas should run. And that commitment to elections was taken to its logical extreme 1 month before these Palestinian elections were supposed to take place, when both Abu Mazen's people, President Mahmoud Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority and a Fatah leader, sent his people to Washington, and the Israeli government sent their people to Washington with a common message. Hamas is going to do well. They didn't expect them to win. Hamas is going to do well. We need to postpone the elections. And they had worked out a joint position that Israel would say that Hamas could not run its candidates in Jerusalem, which is under Israel's complete control. And the Palestinian president would say, we cannot have an election if Hamas isn't allowed to run in Jerusalem. And that would provide the basis for postponing the elections until Fatah could somehow get its act together and run a better group of candidates and a better campaign and perhaps head off Hamas's achievements. And this decision went all the way to the president. President Bush decided that the elections have to go ahead. And I'm told, I don't know whether this is accurate, that he's actually said it would be good for Hamas to be in the government because it will learn to be responsible, accountable to the people. And what do we end up with as a result of a conscious decision by our government to have the elections go ahead? Hamas, with its militias and its terrorist cadres, now in control of the government, as I said before, in the most sensitive part of the Middle East and the Islamic world. So it didn't have to be like this. We could have insisted in every case that there has to be a disarmament process commitment to disarm before these parties would enter the political process. But because we equated democracy with elections, we thought elections would solve the problem, and now we've got a fine mess on our hands throughout the Middle East. What to do about Hamas? Well, as you could see, from my point of view, we shouldn't have let it happen in the first place. And for sure now, the first thing I think is needed is a reassessment of this whole approach to promoting democracy in the Middle East. Not to the objective, which I fully support of promoting democracy, but how we go about it. Sounds familiar? Also a problem of how we went about fighting the war in Iraq. But number two, to the specific question of what to do about Hamas in Palestinian areas, we basically have a choice between bad options. That's unfortunately where we are these days. And I will outline them quickly and explain what's wrong with all of them, and maybe you can decide which one you want to pick. It's days like these that I'm actually glad I'm not in government anymore. The first option, one that's preferred by many Israelis and by some in the Bush administration, and interestingly, by the Fatah leadership itself, we have an unusual coalition here, is to force the collapse of the Hamas government as quickly as possible, to cut it off from funding, to and it needs about $1.6 billion a year just to fund the Palestinian Authority, the salaries and the functioning of the Palestinian government. Cut those funds, which come either from tax revenues collected by Israel or from Western funders, and precipitate an economic crisis and the collapse of the Hamas-led government. The Palestinian people will recognise that they made a mistake by electing this government and will turn back in new elections to Fatah, and we will basically undo the results of the elections in this way. The problem with this option is that the alternative of a Fatah, a newly elected Fatah government, is hardly credible. The Palestinian people are not going to turn back to this group of Abus whom they rejected because of their corruption and fecklessness. And there's no indication that Fatah intends to reform itself in the meantime and produce a more credible list of candidates and that could serve as an alternative, credible alternative government. The consequence of cutting Hamas off like this is that the Palestinian people will support Hamas more, not less, because it's the United States and it's Israel that's punishing the Palestinians for choosing in a freely contested election these people. And you know, it's the law of unintended consequences which seems to happen all the time in the Middle East. We intend to bring Hamas down. What we'll end up doing is reinforcing its support amongst the Palestinians. Plus, if we cut them off, the Iranians will come in with money, the Wahhabi fundamentalists in Saudi Arabia that identify with Hamas, the Muslim Brotherhood connection, will come in with money. And they'll find a way to muddle through. So rather than a collapse, you know, we will attempt something and fail. Or we'll succeed, and instead of leading to a kind of takeover of a more moderate government, we'll end up with chaos there. The chaos is already evident in Gaza. But in the circumstances in which Hamas is completely cut off, we could see the collapse of the Palestinian institutions, the economic institutions, and then what we're left with is a kind of situation which could be quite similar to the situation we now face in Iraq. And what are we going to do then? I mean, if the lesson of Iraq is that we should have planned better, we at least need an answer to the question, what do we do if we succeed in forcing the collapse of Hamas and the collapse of the Palestinian economy? And the people who advocate this option don't have an answer to that. Some of them say, well, the Palestinian people should suffer the consequences of their vote, as if that somehow will solve the problem. The second option is also highly problematic. That's the option of the wishful thinkers, that Hamas will be moderated by the process of assuming government, being accountable to the people, recognising that it didn't win a majority and therefore it's got to grow its constituency, and will be focused on meeting the needs of the Palestinian people, and as a consequence of that, it will choose to moderate its position towards Israel, accept Israel, and negotiate with it, and that by those means we'll be able to resurrect the peace process. This part of the world is quite good for resurrections, you might remember. And in the process, we'll be back on track towards peace in our time. That's also, I think, a highly unlikely scenario. Hamas is an ideological movement. It will say the words, mouth the words, in an attempt to convince the international community that it might find a way through some long-term ceasefire to coexist with Israel. And Hamas is becoming quite good at those kinds of statements. The only trouble is they've got these other guys out there speaking in Tehran or Damascus or a couple of days ago in China, in which they say, no, we're never going to accept Israel. We want to destroy Israel. We've seen this little movie before. It was called the Kaduk movie. I don't know whether any of you remember that. When Arafat, we went through this 10 years of effort to get Arafat to say the magic words, that he would recognize Israel and accept Israel and change his covenant, the PLO covenant charter, which called for the destruction of Israel in 10 of its clauses. And finally, he said, I agree. The Palestinian covenant is Kaduk. Kaduk? What's Kaduk? So we all went scrambling to our French dictionaries to discover that it kind of meant that it was over. But it wasn't over at all for Arafat. And that's the kind of game that this option will lead us into. It's the kind of game that, in a sense, we're already headed down that path, because the quartet, this is the US, the UN, the EU, and the Russians, have put out these three conditions, which are that Hamas must accept Israel, must renounce violence, and must accept prior agreements before the West will deal with them, before the West will provide aid to this government. And so we will get into this game of, did they mean it? Did they really say it? What did they say here? Well, they said something else there. And in the meantime, Hamas will continue on its way as we engage in this game of diplomatic semantics, but something that is not going to change the reality on the ground. The third option is the one that I think should be pursued, but I don't have any great faith in its likelihood of producing a positive result. It is, first of all, to say that Hamas needs to be judged on its actions, not its words. It's now the government, democratically elected government in the Palestinian areas. It has a responsibility as a government to control those territories. It has stopped its own terrorist activities. Its first test must be, will it stop the terrorist activities of the other Palestinian groups? Palestine Islamic Jihad, the Al-Aqsa Martyr Brigades, the Popular Resistance Committees, all of these groups are now actively engaged in trying to perpetrate terrorist attacks or the firing of Qasem rockets into Israeli cities and towns and kibbutzim. Hamas, as the government, has a responsibility to stop those things from happening. If it does so, if it arrests people that are responsible for violence and terrorist activities, it will, in the first instance, have to explain to its own people why Hamas, which means, it's an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, is stopping the resistance of these groups. And that's the kind of explanation that has meaning, because it's going to be an explanation to their own people of why they have to change course. And that will be the test, and it will be an important test, because Fatah didn't do it. They pretended, they arrested some, they let them out. You know, we know what the game was. The only problem with this is that Hamas has said very explicitly, we're not going to stop the resistance. They have the right to resistance. And if that's the case, then the conclusion for me is clear, that they're not interested in moderating their position, and therefore we cannot fund them. But not funding them should not be a strategy of producing their collapse. It should instead be turned around and used as a means of creating an alternative way of meeting the humanitarian needs of the Palestinian people. And it would work something like this. The international community would establish a trust fund in which the monies that previously had gone to paying and supporting the Palestinian Authority and its operations and the operations of NGOs and so on would all be amassed in this trust fund. And the trustees would say, we, the international community, are prepared to pay for the salaries of teachers, health workers, social welfare workers, and to run those institutions, or hospitals and schools, or work with NGOs that are responsible for those things, like UNRWA. But we, the trustees, as a condition for paying for all of this, insist that we control it. That is, to take it out of the hands of the Hamas government, because it cannot pay for this, and put it under the hands of trustees. And in that way, the international community takes control of the institutions, the critical institutions of the Palestinian Authority, and over time can create circumstances where not only are we meeting the needs of the Palestinian people, but Hamas is not meeting the needs of the Palestinian people, and in that way, over time, can create circumstances in which hopefully a new force will emerge, a more moderate force will emerge amongst the Palestinians that can then take control of these institutions. As I say, I'm not entirely convinced myself, but it at least gets us out of the dilemma that we and Israel face. Now, if we cut off the Palestinian Authority, the consequences can be very dire, not just for the Palestinians, but for Israel as well, and for our overall effort to try to win the war on terror by winning the hearts and minds of the Arab and Muslim world. So that's what to do about Hamas. Thank you very much.
Well, for that most interesting presentation, we thank you very much. The floor is now open for questions. In the very rear, yes, sir. The question is, would you comment upon the strategy of giving Hamas full responsibilities and depending upon their adjustment to those responsibilities?
Yeah. Well, thank you. There were a lot of assertions made there, and I just want to take a couple of them apart because they're essential to your thesis. What basically you're advancing here is what I called option B, and what I labelled as the wishful thinking approach. Wishful thinking because it assumes that Hamas is going to function like we'd function if we took power in these circumstances, as we being Westerners. But it simply ignores the fundamental ideological imperative of this movement. It's an ideological movement. It's not just a terrorist movement, it's an ideological movement. As far as your argument that it's limited to the Palestinians, no, it's not. It's connected to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, Jordan, and Turkey. It is part integrated with this whole movement that has deep roots in Arab society. You can shake your head, but that's the reality. And so the notion that you can somehow moderate them by their being in government is a notion that has some precedent in other parts of the world. It has some precedents in the Arab world too, in the Middle East. It has a precedent, let's say, in Jordan and Turkey. Let's look at those precedents, though. What happened there? You have an Islamist government in Turkey, which is a Muslim Brotherhood government, and it's connected to Hamas, by the way. That's why Hamas was received there as one of the first places where they were received. But there you have a strong army and state that constrains what this Islamist party in Turkey does. And it has moderated itself because it understands that if it doesn't moderate itself, the army will come in and take power away from it. In Jordan, you had a similar circumstance in which the Muslim Brotherhood there, which has a Hamas branch in Jordan, won in elections, moved into government, but it was constrained by the monarchy and the army, and eventually failed to meet the needs of the people and moved into opposition. In Egypt, you have a strong state and a strong army, and the Muslim Brotherhood is allowed to run in some of the seats, but basically it's not allowed to take power. In Palestine, you have the exact opposite. You have a crumbling state in the making. All of the institutions are in the process of collapse. The security forces in particular are in disarray, and there is no constraint on what Hamas is able to do. Hamas is now in control of those institutions. So therefore the precedent doesn't apply. And as far as pragmatists taking over, yeah, Ismail Haniyeh, the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister in the Palestinian areas, is a Hamas pragmatist. I'll grant you that. He's a pragmatist. But he's a pragmatist for the same goal as the extremists, as his terrorist cadres. The goal is to establish an Islamist state, first in the territories that they control and then in all of Palestine. They want to do it through the political process. That's the pragmatic part of it. But it doesn't mean their objective has changed. And to believe that their objective will change because they will have to choose between meeting the needs of the people and pursuing their ideology is wrong-headed in this particular case, because they don't intend to choose. They intend to have it both ways. And we don't have an effective way of forcing them to choose.
The question is, to what extent did the invasion of Iraq radicalize the Hamas elements?
I don't see that there's much of a connection there. the insurgency in Iraq is not connected to the Palestinian. I mean, some Palestinians have gone off and fought there, but they're not a significant factor. And in terms of, I think, the point that you're trying to make is that the antipathy towards the United States and the West, generated by what we're doing in Iraq, somehow have affected this. I don't see the connection there. As I outlined the reasons for Hamas's success, it has a lot more to do with the internal struggle within the Palestinian political parties and the failure of Fatah, and on the other hand, the battle with Israel. And as far as the United States' involvement in this, we have essentially stepped back from trying to play a major role in stopping the violence or reconciling the parties. And so, we don't have a very high profile in this. This hasn't been a major enterprise of the Bush administration to try to to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
The question was, if Hamas agrees to preconditions for negotiation, what will it get in return?
Yeah. Well, the implicit bargain here is that it would be recognized as a legitimate government by the international community, particularly by the United States, the EU, the United Nations, and as a consequence of that, would secure the assistance, the aid that has been flowing in the billions of dollars over the last 10 years, that it needs to be able to meet the needs of the Palestinian people. And it would then be eligible to be part of a negotiating process that would produce the two-state solution of a Palestinian state living alongside a Jewish state of Israel, which is a solution which has been endorsed by the entire international community. So that's the bargain. That's what they get.
Our time indeed has run out, and so there are a lot of people with questions. I have to apologize for that, but in any case, this has been a truly educational and absolutely wonderful evening. We thank our guests. Thank you so much.